Maria Santos wiped the sweat from her forehead as she climbed the marble steps of the Whitmore mansion for the first time. The August sun beat down on her dark skin, making the crisp white uniform she wore feel like a furnace. At 42 years old, she had cleaned houses for nearly 20 years, but nothing had prepared her for the sheer size of this place. The mansion stretched across what seemed like acres, with perfectly manicured gardens and a fountain that probably cost more than she made in 5 years. The employment agency had warned her that the Whitmore family was particular about their staff. Richard Whitmore had made his billions in tech companies, and his wife Eleanor came from old money. They expected perfection, silence, and invisibility from their help. Maria needed this job desperately. Her son Miguel was starting college in the fall, and her mother's medical bills kept piling up. She couldn't afford to lose another position. Mrs. Eleanor Whitmore met Maria at the servants' entrance, a tall woman with silver hair pulled back in a severe bun. Her blue eyes looked Maria up and down like she was inspecting a piece of furniture. Eleanor wore a cream-colored dress that probably cost more than Maria's monthly rent, and her pearls gleamed in the afternoon light. "You're the new housekeeper," Eleanor said, not bothering to make it a question. "The agency said you have experience with large homes." "Yes, ma'am. 15 years of experience. I have excellent references," Maria replied, keeping her voice steady despite her nervousness. Eleanor's lips pressed into a thin line. "Let me be clear about expectations. You will arrive at 7 in the morning and leave at 6 in the evening. You will clean the main floors, the family bedrooms, and the guest areas. You are not to speak unless spoken to, and you are certainly not to speak to our daughter unless absolutely necessary." Maria nodded, though something about that last instruction struck her as odd. Why would she not be allowed to speak to their daughter? Most wealthy families she had worked for were protective of their children, but this seemed extreme. "Our daughter Lily is different," Eleanor continued, her voice dropping slightly. "She has special needs that are being handled by professionals. Your job is to clean, not to interact. Is that understood?" "Yes, ma'am. Completely understood." Eleanor led Maria through the mansion, pointing out the various rooms and explaining the cleaning schedule. The house was incredible. High ceilings, crystal chandeliers, artwork that Maria suspected was worth more than most people's homes. Every surface gleamed, every detail was perfect. It felt more like a museum than a place where people actually lived. As they walked through the main hallway, Maria caught sight of a girl sitting alone in what appeared to be a library. The child looked to be about 8 or 9 years old, with blonde curls and wearing a beautiful blue dress. She sat at a large wooden table with books spread around her, but she wasn't reading. Instead, she stared out the window with an expression that seemed far too sad for someone so young. "That's Lily," Eleanor said curtly when she noticed Maria looking. "Remember what I told you?" Maria nodded, but she couldn't shake the image of the lonely-looking child. Something about the way Lily sat so perfectly still, so isolated in that grand room, tugged at her heart. The first week of work passed smoothly. Maria quickly learned the rhythm of the house. Mr. Whitmore left early for his office and rarely returned before 8 in the evening. Mrs. Whitmore spent her days attending charity luncheons, shopping, or meeting with friends for tea. Lily seemed to have a strict schedule of tutors, therapists, and specialists who came to the house throughout the day. What struck Maria most was how quiet the house was. Despite its size and the number of people who worked there, gardeners, a cook, a driver, and now Maria, there was an eerie silence that seemed to hang over everything. The other staff members rarely spoke to each other, and they all seemed to follow the same rule about avoiding Lily. Maria began to observe more carefully during her second week. She noticed that when Lily was in the same room as her parents, they rarely looked directly at her. When they did address her, they spoke loudly and slowly, as if she couldn't understand them. But Maria watched Lily's face during these interactions and saw something that didn't match what the adults seemed to believe. The girl's eyes were sharp and intelligent. She seemed to understand everything that was happening around her. One morning, Maria was cleaning the main staircase when she saw something that made her pause. Lily was walking down the hallway with one of her tutors, a stern-looking woman in a gray suit. The tutor was speaking to Lily in that same loud, slow way that everyone used, but Maria noticed something interesting. When the tutor's back was turned, Lily rolled her eyes and made what appeared to be gestures with her hands. Not random gestures. They looked deliberate, like she was mimicking or commenting on what the tutor had said. Maria had grown up in a neighborhood where she had learned some basic sign language from her neighbor, Mrs. Rodriguez, who was deaf. She recognized that what Lily was doing looked very much like sign language, even if she couldn't understand the specific words. That afternoon, while cleaning the library, Maria found herself alone with Lily for the first time. The girl sat at her usual table, this time with what appeared to be homework spread in front of her. Maria worked quietly, dusting the bookshelves and trying not to disturb the child. But she kept glancing over, curious about what Lily was working on. As she cleaned, Maria accidentally knocked over a small decorative vase. It didn't break, but it made a loud clattering sound as it hit the wooden floor. Maria quickly picked it up, looking around nervously to see if anyone had heard. When she glanced at Lily, she was surprised to see that the girl hadn't even turned around. She continued working on her papers as if nothing had happened. This confirmed something Maria had been suspecting. Lily was deaf. That explained the special needs that Mrs. Whitmore had mentioned so vaguely. It explained why everyone spoke to her so loudly and slowly. But it didn't explain why the family seemed to treat her like she was invisible, or why they acted as if she couldn't understand anything. The next day, Maria made a decision that she knew could cost her the job she desperately needed. She went to the local library during her lunch break and checked out several books about sign language. If Lily was using sign language, and if everyone in the house was ignoring this fact, then maybe Maria could help bridge that gap. She spent the evening studying basic signs, practicing with Miguel when he came home from his summer job. He was skeptical about his mother getting involved in her employer's family business, but he helped her practice anyway. They worked on simple greetings, basic questions, and everyday words. The opportunity to use what she had learned came sooner than expected. On Thursday morning, Maria was cleaning the kitchen when she heard Mrs. Whitmore on the phone in the next room. From the conversation, Maria gathered that Lily's morning tutor had called in sick, and the replacement wouldn't arrive until the afternoon. "I don't have time for this," Mrs. Whitmore was saying into the phone. "I have a board meeting at 10 and lunch with the museum committee at noon. Can't she just stay in her room until the tutor arrives?" Maria felt a familiar anger rising in her chest. She had seen this before in other wealthy households. Parents who were so busy with their social obligations that they treated their children like inconvenient appointments to be managed. But this seemed worse because Lily already seemed so isolated. After Mrs. Whitmore left for her meeting, Maria made another decision that could get her fired. She went to the library where Lily was sitting alone, looking even more sad and lost than usual. Maria approached slowly, not wanting to startle the girl. When she was close enough, Maria waved gently to get Lily's attention. The girl looked up, and Maria saw a surprise flicker across her face. No one ever approached her directly like this. Maria took a deep breath and slowly signed, "Hello," using the sign she had practiced the night before. She wasn't sure she was doing it correctly, and she felt clumsy and uncertain. But the change in Lily's expression was immediate and dramatic. The girl's eyes widened, and her mouth fell open slightly. For a moment, she just stared at Maria as if she couldn't believe what she had seen. Then, slowly, she signed back, "Hello." Maria's heart hammered in her chest. She had been right. Lily knew sign language, and she had been trying to communicate this way all along. But, apparently, no one in her family had bothered to learn how to talk with her. "My name is Maria," Maria signed slowly, using fingerspelling for her name since she didn't know the sign. Lily's face lit up with the first genuine smile Maria had seen from her. She fingerspelled back, Lily, and then signed something else that Maria didn't understand. Maria shook her head and signed, "I don't understand. I am learning." Lily nodded enthusiastically and then did something that broke Maria's heart. She stood up and hugged Maria tightly, as if she hadn't had a real conversation with another person in years. As they separated, Maria heard footsteps in the hallway. She quickly stepped back and pretended to dust a nearby shelf, but not before she saw the hope and excitement in Lily's eyes. For the first time since Maria had started working at the Whitmore mansion, the little girl looked truly alive. The footsteps turned out to belong to the cook, who barely glanced their way before continuing to the kitchen. But Maria knew that her secret communication with Lily couldn't stay hidden for long. If the family found out that their invisible daughter could communicate perfectly well, and that Maria was the one facilitating this communication, there would be consequences. That evening, as Maria rode the bus home to her small apartment, she thought about the choice she was facing. She could continue her job, follow the rules, and pretend she had never seen Lily's sign. She would keep her desperately needed income and avoid any conflict with the Whitmore family. Or she could continue learning sign language and try to give this lonely little girl what she clearly needed most, someone who could truly communicate with her. The next morning, Maria arrived at the Whitmore mansion with her heart beating faster than usual. She had spent most of the night practicing sign language, and Miguel had even helped her learn some basic phrases that a child might want to use. She was excited about the possibility of having another real conversation with Lily, but she was also nervous about being caught. As she entered through the servants' entrance, Maria noticed that Mrs. Whitmore's car was still in the driveway. Usually, Eleanor left for her various appointments by 8 in the morning, but it was already 8:30. Maria wondered if something had changed in the family schedule. She began her morning routine, starting with the main floor bathrooms as always. The house felt different today, though she couldn't put her finger on why. There was a tension in the air that hadn't been there before. Even the other staff members seemed more quiet than usual. Around 10 o'clock, while Maria was cleaning the formal dining room, Mrs. Whitmore appeared in the doorway. Eleanor stood there for a long moment, watching Maria work with an expression that was hard to read. Finally, she spoke. "Maria, I need to speak with you. Come to my study." Maria's stomach dropped. She had been expecting this, but hoping it wouldn't come so soon. She followed Mrs. Whitmore down the hallway to an elegant room lined with books and decorated with expensive art. Eleanor sat behind a large mahogany desk and gestured for Maria to remain standing. "I saw something yesterday that I found very interesting," Mrs. Whitmore began, her voice cool and controlled. "I came home unexpectedly and happened to look into the library. Would you like to tell me what you were doing with my daughter?" Maria's mind raced. She could lie and deny everything, but something told her that Mrs. Whitmore had seen enough to make denial pointless. She could also tell the truth and risk losing her job immediately. Either way, she was probably in serious trouble. "I was communicating with Lily, ma'am," Maria said quietly. Eleanor's eyebrows rose slightly. "Communicating? Maria, my daughter cannot communicate in any meaningful way. She has severe developmental delays along with her hearing impairment. The doctors have been very clear about her limitations." Maria felt a surge of anger that she had to work hard to control. "With respect, ma'am, I believe the doctors might be wrong. Lily understands sign language perfectly, and she can use it to communicate. She's very intelligent." "That's impossible," Eleanor said sharply. "We've had the best specialists evaluate her. They've all concluded that while she might be able to mimic some simple gestures, she doesn't have the cognitive ability for true language." "Have any of those specialists actually learned sign language themselves?" Maria asked, then immediately regretted the boldness of her question. Mrs. Whitmore's face flushed with anger. "How dare you question our medical professionals? You're a housekeeper, not a doctor. You have no qualifications to make assessments about my daughter's condition." "You're right, ma'am. I'm not a doctor. But I grew up around deaf people in my neighborhood. I know what sign language looks like, and I know what intelligence looks like. Your daughter has both." Eleanor stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the wooden floor. "This conversation is over. You will pack your things and leave immediately. I will not have my employees filling my daughter with false hope or interfering with her treatment." Maria felt the words hit her like a physical blow. She needed this job more than Mrs. Whitmore could possibly understand. But as she thought about Lily sitting alone in that library, hungry for someone to truly see and hear her, Maria realized she couldn't simply walk away. "Mrs. Whitmore, please," she said. "Give me one chance to prove what I'm saying. Let me spend 15 minutes with Lily, with you watching. Let me show you that she can communicate." Eleanor laughed, but it was a cold sound without any humor. "Absolutely not. I will not have my daughter subjected to some kind of performance for your benefit. She has been through enough evaluations and tests." "Then, let me ask you something," Maria said, knowing she was probably making things worse but unable to stop herself. When was the last time you had a real conversation with Lily? When was the last time you asked her how she was feeling, or what she was thinking about, or what she wanted? Mrs. Whitmore's face went white with fury. How I interact with my daughter is none of your business. Security will escort you out. But before Eleanor could reach for the phone, a small figure appeared in the doorway of the study. Lily stood there in her pretty yellow dress, looking back and forth between her mother and Maria. Even from across the room, Maria could see the worry in the girl's eyes. "Lily, go back to your room," Mrs. Whitmore said loudly. "The tutor will be here soon." Instead of leaving, Lily stepped further into the room. She looked directly at Maria and signed something. Maria didn't understand all of it, but she recognized the signs for "what's wrong" and "scared." Without thinking, Maria signed back, "It's okay. Don't be scared." The effect on Mrs. Whitmore was immediate. She stared at her daughter as if she was seeing her for the first time. Lily had used clear, deliberate signs, and she had obviously understood Maria's response. That's not possible," Eleanor whispered. Lily seemed to sense that something important was happening. She walked over to her mother's desk and began signing more rapidly. Her hands moved with confidence and purpose, telling a story that Maria couldn't fully follow but that was obviously complex and meaningful. Mrs. Whitmore sank back into her chair, her face pale. "I don't understand what she's saying." "She's trying to tell you something important," Maria said gently. "She's been trying to tell you things for years, probably. But no one learned her language." Lily continued signing, and Maria caught enough words to understand that the girl was talking about being lonely, about wanting to talk to her parents, about feeling invisible. The signs for love, family, and please appeared several times. Finally, Lily stopped and looked expectantly at her mother. When Mrs. Whitmore didn't respond, Lily's face fell with disappointment. She turned to leave the room, but Maria called softly to her. "Lily, wait." The girl turned back, and Maria signed slowly. "Your mother loves you. She doesn't understand your words yet, but she loves you." Lily's eyes filled with tears, and she signed back, "I love her too. I want to talk to her." Maria turned to Mrs. Whitmore, who was watching this exchange with an expression of shock and something that might have been wonder. "She says she loves you too, and she wants to talk to you," Maria translated. Eleanor's hand went to her throat, and Maria could see her struggling with emotions she didn't know how to process. "But the doctors said they all said she couldn't." "The doctors were wrong," Maria said quietly. "It happens more often than you might think, especially with deaf children. If the adults around them don't know sign language, the children get misdiagnosed as having developmental problems when really they just need someone to communicate with them properly." Mrs. Whitmore looked at her daughter as if seeing her for the first time. Lily stood patiently waiting, hope and nervousness warring on her young face. "What do I do?" Eleanor asked, and for the first time, she sounded vulnerable instead of commanding. "You learn her language," Maria said simply. "You start talking to her the way she's been trying to talk to you." Over the next hour, something remarkable happened in the Whitmore study. Mrs. Whitmore asked Maria to teach her some basic signs, and slowly, haltingly, she began to communicate directly with her daughter. The conversation was simple, mostly "hello, I love you," and "I'm sorry," but the impact was profound. Lily was patient with her mother's clumsy attempts at signing, gently correcting her hand positions and beaming with joy every time Eleanor successfully communicated a word. For Mrs. Whitmore, it was clearly overwhelming. She had spent 8 years believing her daughter was cognitively limited, only to discover that Lily had been trying to have sophisticated conversations all along. Why didn't anyone figure this out before? Eleanor asked as she struggled to sign "beautiful daughter." Because everyone was so focused on what they thought she couldn't do that they never looked for what she could do, Maria explained. And because sign language isn't something most hearing people know about unless they have a reason to learn it. But surely the specialists. The specialists were probably good doctors, but if they don't know sign language themselves, they might not recognize it when they see it. And if they were told that Lily had developmental delays, they might have looked for evidence to support that diagnosis instead of questioning it. As the morning progressed, more of Lily's personality emerged. Through Maria's translation, Mrs. Whitmore learned that her daughter loved books, but was frustrated because no one had taught her to read in ways that worked for deaf children. She learned that Lily had been creating her own stories and acting them out alone in her room. She learned that Lily understood everything that happened in the household and had opinions about the staff, the decorations, and even her mother's friends. Most surprising of all, Lily had questions about her father's business and had been trying for years to understand why he was gone so much. She had theories about money and work that showed a level of thinking far beyond what anyone had given her credit for. "She's brilliant," Mrs. Whitmore said at one point, tears streaming down her face. "How could I have missed this? How could I have been so blind?" "You weren't blind," Maria said kindly. "You just didn't have the tools to see. But now you do." When Mr. Whitmore came home that evening, he found his wife and daughter sitting together in the library, practicing sign language with Maria's help. Eleanor had called to cancel all her appointments for the day, and she had sent away Lily's afternoon tutor. Instead, she had spent hours learning to communicate with her daughter. Richard Whitmore stood in the doorway, stunned by the scene, and Maria steeled herself for what she expected would be a final conversation about her termination. She had spent the night thinking about how to find another job quickly and wondering if she had made the right choice in speaking up for Lily. Now, seeing Mrs. Whitmore's changed expression, she wasn't sure what to expect. "I owe you an apology," Eleanor said, her voice quieter than Maria had ever heard it. "More than that, I owe you a debt that I'm not sure I can ever repay." Maria blinked in surprise. This was definitely not what she had expected to hear. "My husband and I stayed up most of the night talking with Lily," Mrs. Whitmore continued. "It was the first real conversation we've had with our daughter in her entire life. She told us things that broke our hearts and opened our eyes." Eleanor gestured for Maria to sit down at the kitchen table, something that would have been unthinkable just 2 days earlier. "She told us how lonely she's been, how she's tried to communicate with us for years, how she's watched us treat her like she was broken." Maria could see tears forming in Mrs. Whitmore's eyes, and she felt her own throat tighten with emotion. "She also told us about you," Eleanor continued, "about how you were the first person in her life to treat her like a real person, to see her intelligence instead of her disability." "Mrs. Whitmore," Maria began, but Eleanor held up her hand. "Please, let me finish. I was wrong. About Lily, about you, about everything. I was so focused on what the doctors told us, so caught up in believing that my daughter was limited, that I never stopped to really look at her. I never stopped to question whether we were getting the right help or asking the right questions." Maria sat quietly, not sure how to respond to this transformation in her employer. "Richard and I have made some decisions," Mrs. Whitmore said. "First, we're firing all of Lily's current tutors and therapists. We're going to find professionals who understand deaf children and who can work with her intelligence instead of around what people assumed were her limitations." She paused and looked directly at Maria. "Second, we want to ask you to stay, not just as our housekeeper, but as Lily's communication bridge while we learn sign language ourselves. We'd like to change your job description and your salary to reflect these new responsibilities." Maria felt dizzy. "Mrs. Whitmore, I'm not qualified to be a tutor or a therapist. I just know a little sign language." "You're qualified to be what Lily needs most right now," Eleanor said firmly. "Someone who sees her as a complete person and who can help her communicate with her family while we learn how to communicate with her. We'll hire professional teachers and therapists, but we need someone Lily trusts to help us through this transition." Before Maria could respond, Lily herself appeared in the kitchen doorway. The little girl's face lit up when she saw Maria, and she rushed over to sign something rapidly. "She says good morning, and she was worried that you wouldn't come back," Mrs. Whitmore translated haltingly, proud of her ability to understand even that simple message. Maria smiled and signed back to Lily, "I'm here. I'm not going anywhere." Lily clapped her hands together in delight, then signed something to her mother. Mrs. Whitmore frowned in concentration, trying to follow the hand movements. "She's asking if we can all have breakfast together?" Eleanor said uncertainly. "Is that right?" Lily nodded enthusiastically and then added something else. "Like a family," Maria translated. "She wants to have breakfast like a family." Mrs. Whitmore's eyes filled with tears again. "We've never done that," she whispered. "In 8 years, we've never just sat down and had a family breakfast where we all talked to each other." So they did. For the first time in Lily's life, the Whitmore family sat around the kitchen table and had a real conversation over breakfast. It was slow and sometimes awkward, with Maria translating between sign language and spoken English, but it was genuine communication. Lily told them about her dreams, about wanting to learn to read better, about wondering what her father's office looked like. Mr. Whitmore, who had been mostly silent during the previous day's revelations, seemed amazed by his daughter's curiosity and intelligence. "She wants to know about my work?" he asked Maria, looking stunned. "She's been wondering about it for years," Maria explained as she translated Lily's rapid signing. "She knows you leave early and come home late, and she wants to understand what you do all day. She's curious about whether you like your job and whether you think about her while you're gone." Richard Whitmore sat back in his chair, looking like a man who was seeing his life from a completely new perspective. "I had no idea she even knew I existed, let alone that she thought about me." "She thinks about both of you all the time," Maria said gently. "She loves you very much, but she's felt invisible in this house. Like she was here, but not really part of the family." Over the following days, the Whitmore household transformed in ways that amazed everyone who worked there. Mrs. Whitmore canceled her social commitments to spend time with Lily. Mr. Whitmore began coming home earlier so he could practice sign language with his wife and daughter. They hired a deaf educator who was fluent in sign language and who immediately recognized Lily's advanced abilities. Maria's role evolved into something she had never expected. She became part teacher, part translator, and part family counselor. She helped the Whitmores understand not just how to communicate with Lily, but how to think about deafness as a difference rather than a disability. One of the most significant changes came when the family started learning about deaf culture. Through their new educator and through research that Mrs. Whitmore threw herself into with characteristic intensity, they discovered that there was an entire community of deaf people who lived rich, full lives without seeing their deafness as a limitation. "I never knew," Eleanor said one afternoon as she and Maria watched Lily working with her new tutor. "I never knew that being deaf didn't mean being broken. I thought we were supposed to fix her." "You don't need to fix her," Maria replied. "You just needed to learn how to reach her." The changes weren't just in communication. As Lily began to feel truly seen and heard by her parents, her whole personality blossomed. She had always been intelligent, but now her intelligence had an outlet. She started asking for books, for art supplies, for music that she could feel through vibrations. She wanted to learn about everything from science to cooking to her father's business. Most remarkably, she started expressing opinions and preferences that no one had ever known she had. She loved purple but hated the pink clothes her mother had been buying for her. She preferred spicy food to the bland meals the cook had been preparing. She wanted to learn to swim and to ride a horse and to visit her father's office. "It's like she was always there," Mr. Whitmore said one evening as the family sat together in the library, now a place of active conversation rather than silent isolation. "She was always this complete person, but we were looking right through her." The transformation wasn't without challenges. Mrs. Whitmore struggled with guilt about the years she felt she had lost with her daughter. Mr. Whitmore had to completely reshape his understanding of success and achievement to include the different but equally valuable accomplishments of a deaf child. And Lily herself sometimes felt overwhelmed by the sudden attention after years of being ignored. But they worked through these difficulties together, with Maria serving as a bridge and guide. She helped them understand that healing would take time and that there would be setbacks along with progress. One of the most powerful moments came about a month into this new life, when Lily asked Maria to help her write a letter to her parents. With Maria's assistance, she crafted a message that she wanted her mother and father to understand completely. The letter said, "Dear Mom and Dad, I want you to know that I don't blame you for not understanding me before. I know you were trying to help me in the way you thought was right. I'm happy that we can talk now, and I want to learn everything I can and share everything with you. I love you both so much, and I'm excited about our family's future. Your daughter, Lily." When Mrs. Whitmore read this letter aloud while Mr. Whitmore looked on, there wasn't a dry eye in the room. For the first time, they were seeing not just their daughter's intelligence, but her emotional wisdom and capacity for forgiveness. "She's extraordinary," Eleanor whispered. "Not because she's overcome her deafness, but because of who she is as a person." "She always was," Maria said quietly. "You just needed the right lens to see her clearly." As word of Lily's situation spread among the family's friends and social circle, the Whitmores found themselves becoming advocates for deaf children and their families. Mrs. Whitmore began volunteering with organizations that supported deaf education, and Mr. Whitmore started funding research into better diagnostic practices for deaf children. They also made changes to their household that reflected their new understanding of Lily's needs. They installed visual alert systems for things like doorbells and fire alarms. They made sure that Lily had access to technology that would help her communicate with the outside world. And they began planning for a future that included all the possibilities they had never imagined for their daughter. But perhaps the most significant change was in how they saw Maria herself. She was no longer just an employee, but a member of their extended family who had given them the greatest gift possible: a real relationship with their daughter. 6 months after that first conversation in sign language, the Whitmore household had become almost unrecognizable from what it had been before. The formal dining room, which had once been used only for business entertaining, now hosted family dinners where animated conversations flowed in both spoken English and sign language. The library, where Lily had once sat in lonely silence, became a gathering place where the whole family shared books, homework, and stories about their days. Maria's role had evolved far beyond what anyone could have imagined. She had become Lily's primary communication partner while her parents continued to improve their sign language skills. But more than that, she had become a trusted advisor to the entire family as they navigated their new reality. The transformation hadn't gone unnoticed in the broader community. Word had spread about the remarkable changes in the Whitmore family, and Maria found herself in an unexpected position as other families reached out for guidance. One Tuesday afternoon, Maria answered the phone to find Dr. Patricia Williams on the line. Dr. Williams was a pediatric audiologist at the city's children's hospital, and she had heard about Lily's situation through professional networks. "Mrs. Santos," Dr. Williams said, "I hope you don't mind me calling directly. I've been hearing remarkable things about the work you've done with the Whitmore family. I have several families in my practice who are struggling with similar situations, and I wondered if you might be willing to share your insights." Maria was hesitant. "Dr. Williams, I'm not a professional. I'm just someone who learned some sign language and paid attention to what a child was trying to tell her parents." "Sometimes that's exactly what's needed," Dr. Williams replied. "Would you be willing to meet with me? I think you could help us understand how to better support families like the Whitmores." This conversation led to Maria's involvement in something she had never expected to be part of. Dr. Williams invited her to speak at a conference for medical professionals about the importance of considering sign language and deaf culture when evaluating deaf children. The idea terrified Maria, but Mrs. Whitmore encouraged her to accept. "You have knowledge that could help other children like Lily," Eleanor said. "You have an obligation to share it." Preparing for the presentation forced Maria to think more deeply about what had actually happened in the Whitmore household. With help from the deaf educator they had hired and guidance from Dr. Williams, Maria began to understand that Lily's situation was far from unique. Many deaf children, particularly those born to hearing parents, were misdiagnosed with cognitive disabilities simply because their communication methods weren't recognized or understood. The medical and educational systems were often ill-equipped to distinguish between a child who couldn't communicate and a child who was communicating in a language that adults didn't know. The day of the conference, Maria stood before an audience of doctors, audiologists, speech therapists, and educators. She wore the same professional outfit that Mrs. Whitmore had bought for her, but she felt more nervous than she had ever felt cleaning houses. "My name is Maria Santos," she began, her voice shaking slightly. 6 months ago, I was a housekeeper who knew a little sign language. Today, I want to tell you about how that little bit of knowledge changed everything for a family that had been struggling for 8 years. She told Lily's story, emphasizing not her own role, but the missed opportunities and the assumptions that had shaped how the family saw their daughter. She talked about the intelligence that had been hidden behind language barriers, and the frustration that a young girl had endured as she tried desperately to communicate with parents who didn't know how to listen. The doctors and specialists who evaluated Lily were good people doing their best with the knowledge they had, Maria said. But they were missing a crucial piece of the puzzle. They were looking at what Lily couldn't do instead of what she could do. And because no one in the system knew sign language fluently, no one recognized that she was already communicating in a sophisticated way. The response was overwhelming. After her presentation, Maria was surrounded by professionals who wanted to know more. Some shared their own stories of children who might have been similarly misunderstood. Others asked for guidance on how to better support families dealing with deafness. Dr. Williams later told Maria that her presentation had sparked changes in how their hospital approached deaf children. They began requiring at least one fluent sign language user on every evaluation team, and they started connecting families with deaf culture resources from the very beginning of the diagnosis process. But the most meaningful response came from parents. Over the following weeks, Maria received letters and phone calls from families who had heard about her story. Some were parents of deaf children who wondered if they had been missing something important. Others were adults who were deaf themselves and wanted to thank her for advocating for a child who couldn't advocate for herself. One letter particularly moved Maria. It came from a young woman named Sarah Chun, who was deaf and worked as a computer programmer in the city. Dear Mrs. Santos, the letter read, I saw the news story about you and the Whitmore family. I wanted to thank you for what you did for Lily, and to tell you that you probably saved her from a life that I know all too well. I was misdiagnosed as a child and spent years in programs for cognitively disabled children before someone realized I was just deaf and intelligent. By the time anyone figured it out, I had missed so much education and social development that it took years to catch up. You gave Lily something precious, the chance to be understood by her family from a young age. Please know that what you did matters more than you might ever realize. Letters like this one helped Maria understand that her decision to speak up for Lily had implications far beyond one family. But they also reminded her that there were probably many other children still sitting in silence, waiting for someone to see their potential. Meanwhile, Lily herself was thriving in ways that amazed everyone who knew her. With access to proper deaf education resources and a family that could finally communicate with her, she was making rapid progress in all her studies. But more importantly, she was developing into a confident, articulate young person with clear interests and goals. She had discovered a passion for art and spent hours drawing detailed pictures that told complex stories. She loved science, particularly astronomy, and had convinced her father to set up a telescope on their roof. She was learning to play piano, feeling the vibrations through her body, and reading music visually in ways that fascinated her new teachers. Perhaps most remarkably, Lily had begun advocating for other deaf children herself. When she learned about Maria's involvement in professional conferences, she asked if she could help too. Her parents were initially protective, but they had learned to trust their daughter's judgment and capabilities. Lily began writing letters to doctors and educators, sharing her perspective as someone who had experienced both sides of the communication divide. Her insights were profound and practical, offering suggestions for how professionals could better recognize and nurture the abilities of deaf children. One of her letters, addressed to Dr. Williams and shared with permission at another conference, read, Dear doctors, when you meet a deaf child, please remember that we have thoughts and feelings just like hearing children. We might not talk with our voices, but we talk with our hands and our eyes and our whole bodies. If you don't understand our language, please learn it or find someone who does. Don't decide we can't think just because you can't understand our thoughts. We have so much to say if someone will just listen with their eyes instead of their ears. The letter was so powerful that it was published in a medical journal, making Lily one of the youngest people ever to have her writing featured in professional medical literature. As Lily's confidence grew, so did her relationship with her parents. They had family traditions now that incorporated both deaf and hearing culture. They attended deaf community events where Lily could meet other deaf children and adults. They had family movie nights where they watched films with subtitles and family game nights where communication flowed seamlessly between spoken and signed conversation. Mr. Whitmore had become particularly passionate about creating opportunities for deaf young people. He started a scholarship fund for deaf students pursuing higher education and began working with colleges to improve their accessibility services. He often said that his daughter had taught him more about success and achievement than all his business ventures combined. Mrs. Whitmore channeled her social influence into advocacy work, organizing fundraisers for deaf education programs, and speaking to other wealthy families about the importance of truly seeing and understanding their children's needs. She had become a different person, warmer, more authentic, and more purposeful in how she spent her time. But perhaps the most significant change was in how the family saw Maria. She was no longer an employee at all, but something closer to a family member. They had insisted on adjusting her salary to reflect her new responsibilities, and they had helped her enroll in formal sign language interpreter training so she could better serve other families in the future. Maria's own son Miguel had been deeply affected by watching his mother's transformation. He had started learning sign language himself and had decided to change his college major to deaf education. He wanted, he said, to help other families have the same breakthrough that the Whitmores had experienced. "You showed me that speaking up for someone who needs help isn't just the right thing to do," Miguel told his mother one evening. "It's sometimes the only thing to do." 3 years had passed since Maria Santos first signed hello to Lily Whitmore in that quiet library. The changes that had begun with that simple gesture had rippled outward in ways none of them could have anticipated, touching lives far beyond the walls of the mansion where it all started. Maria stood in the hallway of the new Whitmore Center for Deaf Education, watching through a window as Lily worked with a group of younger deaf children. At 12 years old, Lily had become something of a mentor in the deaf community, helping newly diagnosed children and their families navigate the early stages of communication and acceptance. The center itself was Mr. Whitmore's way of ensuring that other families wouldn't go through what his family had experienced. It combined cutting-edge research with practical family support, offering everything from sign language classes for parents to advanced educational programs for deaf children. Maria served as the family liaison coordinator, helping bridge the gap between medical professionals and the families they served. "She's remarkable with them," said Dr. Elena Rodriguez, who had become the center's director. Dr. Rodriguez was deaf herself, one of the first deaf directors of a major educational facility in the city. Her appointment had been controversial in some circles, but her credentials were impeccable, and her results spoke for themselves. Maria nodded as she watched Lily patiently showing a 5-year-old boy how to sign his name. The little boy's parents sat nearby, still awkward with their own signing, but clearly devoted to learning their son's language. "She remembers what it felt like to be invisible," Maria replied. "That makes her a powerful advocate for children who are going through the same thing." The success of the Whitmore Center had brought national attention to the issues surrounding deaf education and family communication. Maria found herself traveling to conferences across the country, sharing Lily's story and training other professionals in what they now called family-centered deaf education. The approach was simple in concept, but revolutionary in practice. Instead of focusing primarily on what deaf children couldn't do, professionals were trained to identify and build on what they could do. Instead of immediately pushing for cochlear implants or oral communication, families were given comprehensive information about all their options, including sign language and deaf culture. Most importantly, families were connected with deaf adults who could serve as role models and mentors, showing parents what successful deaf lives looked like. One of Maria's most rewarding projects had been the development of a program that trained deaf adults to work with newly diagnosed families. These mentors could offer perspectives that hearing professionals, no matter how well-intentioned, simply couldn't provide. Sarah Chun, the computer programmer who had written to Maria after her first conference presentation, had become one of the program's most effective mentors. She often told families about her own difficult journey and how different things might have been if she had received proper support from the beginning. "I show parents what their children can become," Sarah explained to Maria during one of their planning meetings. "When they see me living independently, having a career, raising my own children, they realize that deafness doesn't limit their child's future. It just makes it different." The mentorship program had helped hundreds of families, but Maria was particularly proud of its impact on the medical community. Doctors and audiologists who worked with the program consistently reported that their approach to deaf patients had fundamentally changed. Dr. Williams, who had first reached out to Maria after hearing about Lily's story, had become one of the program's strongest supporters within the medical community. She often spoke about how working with deaf mentors had transformed her practice. "I used to see my job as helping families cope with their child's hearing loss," she told a gathering of pediatric audiologists. "Now I see my job as helping families celebrate their child's entry into a rich and vibrant deaf community. The perspective shift has made all the difference for the families I serve." Meanwhile, Lily herself had become something of a celebrity in educational circles. Her writing had been featured in multiple professional journals, and she had spoken at conferences about her experiences as a misunderstood deaf child. But, despite the attention, she remained grounded and focused on helping others. She had started a blog called Listen with Your Eyes, where she wrote about deaf culture, shared stories from other deaf young people, and offered advice to families navigating deafness. The blog had attracted thousands of readers and had been translated into multiple languages. One of her most popular posts was titled, "Things I Wish Hearing People Knew About Deaf People." In it, she wrote, "We're not broken versions of hearing people. We're complete versions of deaf people. We have our own language, our own culture, and our own ways of experiencing the world that are just as valid as yours. When you learn our language, you're not helping us become more like you. You're allowing yourself to become part of our world too." The post had been shared thousands of times and had sparked conversations in schools, medical offices, and family living rooms around the world. Mrs. Whitmore had channeled her social connections and organizational skills into advocacy work that extended far beyond deaf education. She had become a powerful voice for all children with disabilities, arguing that society's tendency to underestimate these children often became the biggest barrier to their success. "Lily taught me that the problem was never her deafness," Eleanor said during a speech to a gathering of philanthropists. "The problem was our inability to see past our own limitations to recognize her strengths. How many other children are we failing because we're looking at them through the wrong lens?" Her advocacy had led to policy changes in several states, requiring that deaf children be evaluated by teams that included at least one fluent sign language user. She had also pushed for legislation mandating that families be given comprehensive information about deaf culture and sign language, not just medical interventions. Mr. Whitmore had discovered that his business acumen could be a powerful tool for social change. He had not only funded the center but had also invested in deaf-owned businesses and had worked to create employment opportunities for deaf adults in various industries. One of his most successful initiatives was a program that trained deaf individuals for careers in technology, an industry where communication barriers were often less problematic than in other fields. The program had a 90% job placement rate and had become a model for similar efforts in other cities. "Lily showed me that success isn't about overcoming your differences," Richard often said. "It's about finding environments where your differences become strengths." For Maria, the journey had been both professionally and personally transformative. She had completed her interpreter training and had earned a degree in deaf studies, funded by the Whitmore family, but achieved through her own hard work and dedication. Her son Miguel had graduated from college with a degree in deaf education and was now working at the center as a teacher. He often said that watching his mother advocate for Lily had taught him more about courage than any textbook could have. "My mom showed me that you don't have to be an expert to make a difference," Miguel reflected during a staff meeting. "You just have to be willing to see people as they really are and to speak up when something isn't right." The ripple effects of that first conversation had reached into the most unexpected places. The story of Maria and Lily had been featured in documentaries, academic papers, and news articles around the world. But, more importantly, it had inspired changes in how deaf children were evaluated and supported in communities far from the original mansion where it all began. Maria regularly received letters from families whose lives had been changed by programs inspired by Lily's story. Parents wrote to thank her for helping create resources that allowed them to communicate with their children. Deaf adults wrote to share how the advocacy efforts had improved their own lives, and opportunities. But perhaps the most meaningful correspondence came from young deaf people themselves, who wrote to Lily and Maria about feeling seen and valued in ways they never had before. One letter that Maria kept on her desk came from a teenager named Marcus in Chicago. Dear Ms. Santos and Lily, I wanted to thank you for changing how people think about deaf kids like me. Because of programs like yours, my parents learned sign language when I was little, and I never had to feel invisible like Lily did. I'm captain of my school's academic team now, and I'm planning to study medicine in college. I want to be a deaf doctor so other deaf kids can see that we can do anything. Thank you for making that possible. On the third anniversary of that first sign conversation, the extended community that had grown around Lily's story gathered for a celebration at the center. Families, professionals, deaf community members, and advocates filled the auditorium for an evening of performances, presentations, and reflection. Lily, now a confident 12-year-old, served as the master of ceremonies, signing while a voice interpreter spoke her words for the hearing audience members. 3 years ago, I thought I was the only person in the world who felt invisible, she signed. Tonight, I look out at all of you, and I see a community of people who are committed to making sure no child ever has to feel that way again. She paused and looked directly at Maria, who was sitting in the front row next to her parents. Maria, you gave me the greatest gift anyone can give another person. You saw me, really saw me, and because you were brave enough to speak up, you didn't just change my life. You changed how our whole community thinks about deaf children and their families. Lily turned back to the audience. But I want everyone here to remember that Maria wasn't a superhero or an expert. She was just someone who paid attention and cared enough to act. That means any of us can be that person for someone else who needs to be seen. As the evening continued with performances by deaf artists and presentations about the center's expanding programs, Maria reflected on the unexpected path her life had taken. She had started as a woman desperate for a job to support her family. She had become an advocate, educator, and voice for change in ways she never could have imagined. But as she watched Lily confidently interacting with deaf adults, hearing children, and everyone in between, Maria knew that the most important transformation hadn't been her own. It had been the recognition that every person, regardless of their differences, deserved to be seen, heard, and valued for who they truly were. The story that began with a simple hello in sign language had become something much larger, a movement toward understanding, acceptance, and the profound power of human connection across any barrier. And at its heart remained the truth that had started it all. Sometimes the most important thing you can do is pay attention to someone who needs to be seen. Years later, when people asked Maria what she had learned from her experience with the Whitmore family, she always gave the same answer. I learned that courage doesn't require you to be fearless. It just requires you to care more about doing what's right than about what might happen to you for doing it. And I learned that when you really see another person, not who you think they should be, but who they actually are, you give them the greatest gift possible. You give them the chance to be themselves. The mansion where it all began had become a place of warmth and connection, filled with the laughter and conversation of a family that had finally learned to truly communicate. And in cities around the world, other families were discovering the same joy of real connection, thanks to the simple act of one woman who decided to see a lonely child and brave enough to speak up for what she knew was right. 1 year after that first sign conversation in the library, the Whitmore family held a celebration. It wasn't just a family gathering, but a community event that brought together the medical professionals, educators, and deaf community members who had become part of their extended family. Lily, now 9 years old and confident in both sign language and written English, gave a short speech about what the year had meant to her. She stood in front of the group, signing while Maria provided voice interpretation. A year ago, I felt like I was invisible, Lily signed. My parents loved me, but they couldn't see me. Now I feel like I'm part of a family and part of a community where I belong. I learned that being deaf doesn't mean being broken. It just means communicating in a different way. She turned to Maria, who was standing nearby. Maria showed my parents how to see me, but she also showed me something important. She showed me that sometimes the right person can change everything, but only if they're brave enough to speak up when something isn't right. As applause filled the room, both the sound of clapping hands and the visual applause of waving hands used in deaf culture, Maria felt overwhelmed by how much had changed since that nervous first day at the Whitmore mansion. She had taken a job as a housekeeper and had ended up helping to transform a family and inspiring changes in how an entire community approached deaf education. But as she looked around the room at all the faces, the families who had found new ways to communicate, the professionals who had learned to see deaf children differently, and, most importantly, Lily herself, confident and radiant in her place at the center of it all, Maria knew that the real transformation hadn't been hers to give. It had been Lily's all along. She had just needed someone willing to listen. "I don't know how to thank you," Mrs. Whitmore said one evening as she and Maria sat together watching Mr. Whitmore and Lily work on a puzzle, their hands flying as they chatted in sign language. "You don't need to thank me," Maria replied. "This is what any parent would want for their child. I just helped you see what was already there." Eleanor shook her head. "It was more than that. You risked your job to stand up for a child who couldn't speak for herself. You saw her worth when her own parents were blind to it. You changed all of our lives." Maria looked at Lily, who was laughing silently at something her father had signed, her whole face bright with joy and engagement. "She changed her own life," Maria said. "She just needed someone to listen." The story of how Maria Santos, a housekeeper from a working-class neighborhood, had opened the eyes of one of the wealthiest families in the city began to spread beyond their immediate circle. But the real story wasn't about class differences or dramatic revelations. It was about the simple but profound act of seeing another person's full humanity and the courage to speak up when something was wrong. And of him, he had never seen his wife and daughter interacting so naturally, and he had certainly never seen Lily looking so animated and happy. "What's going on here?" he asked. Mrs. Whitmore looked up at him with red eyes, but a brighter expression than Maria had ever seen on her face. "Richard, we need to talk. About Lily, about everything we thought we knew, and about everything we need to change." That evening, after Maria had finally gone home, the Whitmore family had their first real conversation in 8 years. It was halting and difficult, conducted through a mixture of gestures, written words, and the few signs that Eleanor had learned. But it was real communication, and for the first time, Lily was able to tell her parents how she felt about her life. Maria didn't know about that conversation until the next morning, when she arrived at work expecting to find her belongings packed and ready for her departure. Instead, she found Mrs. Whitmore waiting for her in the kitchen with an expression that was completely different from the angry woman she had left the day before. "Maria," Eleanor said as soon as she walked in, "we need to talk." Maria thought about her own son, Miguel, and how different his childhood had been. They hadn't had money, but they had always talked to each other. Even when Miguel was very young, Maria had treated him like a person whose thoughts and feelings mattered. She couldn't imagine ignoring him or treating him as if he didn't exist. By the time the bus reached her stop, Maria had made her decision. She would continue learning sign language, and she would find ways to communicate with Lily. She would have to be careful, and she would have to be smart about it. But she couldn't walk away from a child who needed help. What Maria didn't know was that her simple greeting in sign language had started something that would change not just Lily's life, but the entire Whitmore family. And it would test everything Maria believed about doing what was right, even when it came with a price she might not be able to pay. That night, as Maria practiced more signs with Miguel's help, she didn't notice Mrs. Whitmore's car pulling into the mansion's driveway much earlier than usual. And she certainly didn't know that Mrs. Whitmore had forgotten her purse and had briefly returned home, just in time to see something through the library window that would change everything.